Good afternoon. I'm Jeremy Sawyer, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow in psychology at Temple University. I do some research on bilingualism, and it's my pleasure today to do an interview with Annick De Houwer. It's an honor to speak with you today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
You know, your research on bilingualism and language acquisition, the development of bilingual children and families, it's made a big impact on bilingual families, bilingual children. I think also on practitioners in the field who are working with bilinguals. In a previous life, I was a school psychologist who worked with a lot of bilingual families, so your recommendations come in very handy in working with bilingual families.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, and I think your work has shown it's okay to be bilingual, and it can, which is a big question out there for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I'm just, for people who are maybe less familiar with your work or a general audience, wondering if you could say a little bit about what your research contributes to our understanding of bilingualism and bilingual acquisition.
Wow. Yes, well, that's a tall order. I'll try. Oh, I do think that some of my work has shown, first, I know many decades ago, I started really describing the development of two languages within one child, which at the time had not been really researched that much. And I really showed that a child really learns two separate languages. I know that there's some people who would even question the idea of whether there is one language and another language. But, in my view, yes, little children definitely, they put together things that belong together, so to speak. They don't make a huge mishmash out of the two languages that they hear as spoken by different people in different situations. Which had been an idea before then, and is part of this idea, what you're saying, like people, they don't feel so comfortable with this idea of bilingualism because they have this idea that it's going to be like this big mishmash and kids are not going to be able to talk properly, meaning, just mainly in one language. And I've shown that absolutely this is totally possible. I've also shown that, demonstrated in my writings that children do learn what they hear. So if they hear a lot of utterances that have a lot of words from different languages in them, they're also going to learn that. There's nothing peculiarly interesting about that personally, I believe, but the input, so what children hear, is going to help determine greatly what they learn. And I think that is something that a lot of people don't realize enough, that, children do pay attention to what they hear and try to emulate that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people out there have the misconception that hearing two languages from an early age will confuse the child, or maybe they'll mix the grammar of one language and the other and it'll interfere with each other. And I feel like your work kind of showing that these languages develop separately and simultaneously, and kids kind of pick up that grammar of both language. This has kind of now become common knowledge in the field, but it wasn't at the time you proposed it.
Right, it wasn't. And let me say at the same time that there's nothing really wrong with kids using within one sentence words from two languages, as long as everybody else understands them. And that is the crux of the matter. Children learn to talk the way that they are understood. So they're not going to talk, if a child learns Greek and English, for instance, but there's only like a few people in their lives who understand Greek, the child is not going to speak Greek to everybody. They're going to speak Greek to those people who understand Greek, because that's the whole point. Language is to be made, to make yourself understood, to communicate. That is not a confusion, but they can speak maybe Greek and English to one person who speaks both Greek and English. That's fine. That's not confusing. That is doing what is natural and communicatively okay. yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot more to be said, but
Yes, I know there is. And yeah, thank you for giving us a little taste of your research today, which is very vast and broad, and I encourage people to look into it and read your works.
Thank you very much.
And I'm interested also to talk about some of the work you've been doing recently. And I should say we're here doing this interview as part of the first HaBilNet Colloquium.
Yeah.
And HaBilNet stands for Harmonious Bilingual Network.
Right.
And you've developed the concept of harmonious bilingual development within families, and thinking about how children and families can create a harmonious well-being in the language learning experience.
Right.
And I'd love if you could share a little bit with the audience about what the concept of harmonious bilingual development is.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yes, because I think indeed, you know, you already mentioned it, that people have this idea, or used to have this idea, there are some people who still do, that, you know, early bilingualism is something that is bad for children, that confuses them, and so forth and so on. On the other hand, you have all these people who think that children just learn languages just like that. So there's all kinds of ideas about early bilingual development that people have that will have an effect on what they actually do with children and whether they're going to be able to give, well, children the support that they need to develop bilingually. There's also ideas that people have in schools, parents, pediatricians, early childcare staff, ideas that they have about bilingualism which may actually result in negative effects on real children and real families. And I think it is really time for us as a field to pay a lot more attention to all that, and to also be honest and not have just this idea, oh, bilingualism is great, which, you know, it can be very great, but for a lot of people, well, it's not been that great because they've got experiences where people tell them to stop speaking one of their languages. People are ridiculing them because they think they cannot speak both languages properly, and all kinds of different things. So bilinguals often feel that they have a problem. They feel of themselves that they're not doing well enough in each language. They're comparing themselves to monolinguals. And that's what I want to get at the bottom of more, is to try and understand the circumstances in which people feel good about their languages, or where they have no particular feelings about them because everything's okay. So it could be also neutral, you know, like, hey, it just is, you know, I speak several languages, so what? You know, no big deal, which is what I think that's what it should be like. But, you know, or people could also feel very proud of their bilingualism and feel, you know, no real problems associated with it from their perspective. But then there's a whole lot of other people who do. And I want to understand more what these, what the factors are. And I think I know for a fact that those factors are mainly environmental factors that will feed into these feelings. They're not things that come from people themselves. You know, how people feel, of course, is something that they are very individual about. But the forces that bring people to feel particular ways, I think that a lot of them are environmental. And I think, and that's why I'm interested in building this network and launching this network, to have like-minded researchers as myself who are also care about understanding that more. So this feeling of well-being with a language context setting, within a language context setting, to understand that better and do research to improve our understanding of that, and also at the same time work with people in the field, practitioners, parents, educators, medical doctors, who are still very often, pediatricians are still very often the people to give advice to families about a bilingual upbringing, and to do this from an evidence research-based perspective. I know that there are lots of websites, but you know, I think we need, I think it's about time that we have more, as researchers, more an eye towards all that also, because we're dealing with real people, we're studying real people, and we should also be in a position to give something back, maybe, you know.
And it means a lot to parents and families when it comes from a person they're working with a practitioner,
Yes.
a real person. It has a lot more impact, it seems like.
That's right. Yeah. Of course, and there's been ideas. I've been long enough in the field to realize, there's ideas that change throughout the time. When people think, when I started as a PhD student, oh yeah, early bilingualism, especially in this country, Belgium, where I work, or where I was working at the time, oh, it was awful and terrible to speak two languages to your child. You would confuse the child and so forth. And, I've seen these things change throughout the time, not necessarily all in Belgium, but even in Belgium things have changed. But sometimes they change back, so it's a constant reminder of, there's always new generations of parents, there's new generations of children, obviously, so, and of people who work in speech therapy and in education, and there is, of course, more and more knowledge of bilingualism, because I do believe that there's more and more bilingual people, generally, that this, with globalization and so forth, that there's just a whole lot more of it. We don't have any numbers about that, but that's my impression, for what it's worth. So for more and more people, it's no longer something that's very strange and foreign to them, depending on where you live, of course. But so there is more of a recognition of it being a normal thing. And luckily, there's more and more recognition of an article in the Universal Declaration of Child Rights, the UN, which has been ratified by many countries in the late 80s, early 90s, I believe, yes, where it says that, institutes of education should pay real attention to children's right to their own language. And that's becoming more and more recognized in all kinds of circles, that this is a very important article in the Convention for Child Rights. And that convention, actually, that article guides my my social justice perspective, so to speak. It's very basic, and I think if it's like a UN convention, I think a lot of people have agreed on it. So I think that's a good, position to start from.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about sort of thinking about the political, social aspects toward why bilinguals have often felt marginalized in our societies and through history. And in the United States, where I'm from, we have lots of immigrants from different places, and unfortunately there's often been English-only movements that sort of say, no, it's English or nothing, and no other languages should be spoken in our school, and I think that has a really harmful impact on children and families. So it seems like you're saying it's important to change our society possibly as well, and work politically as well as bilingual advocates?
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. This is something that happens on, or should happen on the societal level, and which does happen a lot on the societal level. But having a recognition of bilingualism and people's right to their language, obviously, it's very political. And we know that in some countries you can get shot for speaking a particular language. In Belgium, children are still being punished for speaking. Today, are still being punished at school for speaking a language that is not Dutch, for instance. It happens a lot in Flanders. Yes, unfortunately, there's documentation of that. I'm not kidding. So it's not just in the United States, this English only, a monoglottal, monolingual ideology, as we call it, and as we also express it and explain it in the Handbook of Bilingualism, which is also partly one of the reasons that we're having this first HaBilNet Colloquium, is to celebrate that handbook. This monoglossic ideology, that is really very, very, it's discriminatory, and it's a constant work, anti-discriminatory work, and this is political, obviously, yes, and to be, activist work, absolutely. People have a right to their own voice and to their own language everywhere, all over the world, they do. And anybody who says it's not true, well, I'm sorry, but you're wrong.
Yes, that makes me so happy
morally
to hear.
Wrong.
Yes.
You're morally wrong, yeah.
Yeah. It makes me happy to hear you say that, and this this colloquium also marks the launch of the HaBilNet network.
Yes, I hope so.
And we're, I'll be looking forward to meeting lots of people who are doing this kind of work. And what do you see as kind of the goals that you're thinking about for the HaBilNet network, or maybe the next steps or things that people should be thinking about or working on within the network?
Well, first of all, as kind of more of a structure, I would hope that out of this colloquium that there will be a number of people who have either already, I know that, we've invited some people who've already been engaged with research on well-being and bilingualism. So I would hope that they would be interested in being part of the network and helping us find, ideas about what can we do, in terms on the level of research and in terms of work on websites, up with the public, with stakeholders and so forth. And so that is definitely one thing. And that maybe also there are people who haven't yet worked in this area, that they would, maybe start to develop an interest in that area in their research, that we can help maybe discuss ideas for projects, cooperative ideas. It doesn't all have to do with money, but just basically with a particular perspective that you do on research that maybe you were already doing, but you could maybe add an aspect that would, give us more information about and more insight into the dynamics of, the development of harmonious bilingualism. Mm-hmm. So that would be great. So to have this network and to expand it and to have it be international also more. Right now it's very small. It's basically me and a few people occasionally, but that's not a network. So it's something that personally for me, I'm going towards the end of my career, definitely in terms of the years that I could still officially work. In Europe, there are particularly mandatory retirement ages. So, but definitely for me, that's like something I'd really want to put my energy into, to expand this network still, and to help create a solid base, and where there is really this large network of people and everywhere, not only researchers but also practitioners who communicate with practitioners, and that doesn't happen enough. Yeah, I know we're all very busy, and we need to be in our niche to really become a real specialist in a particular topic. We all do, also as practitioners, the same thing, but it's not enough. We need to have a structure where we can meet each other and talk to each other, because we need to look at this complex phenomenon from all sides in order to understand it better, and to also help people, real people. And the most beautiful things that happen to me, or have happened to me professionally, is when people who either I know, who don't know, but that they tell me, oh, because of what you said, I thought about it and we changed it in our family, and it's going great. Well, that's super for me. I love that, Or somebody who is a clinician who says, oh, well, I heard you speak and I thought about it, and I had a totally different idea before, thought about it a little more, and now, I try to apply what you said in my work, and it seems to work. I'm thinking like, yes, that's great. It makes me very happy.
Yeah, that must be such a feeling of
it's
satisfaction.
Very rewarding. It's very rewarding,
to see it.
But
really...
all this research and all this sitting and hours of counting little peas, as some people say, it actually comes to some fruition at some point,
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's nice, but we're never there. It's never finished. There will always be more work to do.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yes, things change all the time.
Yeah.
And it's very complex.
Yeah, feels good when we can break down those walls and get information out there and see ideas change and help people. Right. And I look forward to this weekend laying the foundations for more of that work to happen.
I hope so. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
And I'm curious to ask you, as you know, there's been a debate raging within the field of bilingualism over just what kind of cognitive advantages might growing up bilingual entail for bilingual children. And as we know, there's tons of advantages to being bilingual. Not only is it a natural part of development and language acquisition, but helps us communicate across cultures. It brings people together, I think, in many ways. So there's plenty of advantages already. Just curious if you have any thoughts about sort of the debate that's been going on about specific cognitive bilingual advantages, or if you wanted to weigh in on that question.
Well, first off, I do not work in this area of cognition, and I'm not a psychologist or cognitive psychologist. So I want to make that quite sure. At the same time, especially through my work on the handbook, I have read, I would say, the bulk of the relevant literature that's being cited in this area. What I have always tried, and I think this connects up with harmonious bilingualism, what I have always striven to avoid, although I have done a little bit of that kind of work myself, namely comparing bilinguals with monolinguals. Now, that's still possible to do with very small children here in Europe, because you can still find children who are just raised with one variety or one language. But as they get older and go through school, very soon they'll be, learning all these other varieties, and then, basically it becomes methodologically impossible to do really controlled experiments with just a monolingual group and just a bilingual group. In Europe, anybody who tells you they've done a real study with monolinguals, I would have like red flashers going on, because personally, I don't know a single monolingual. In Europe, even people who are not very well versed in a second language, they will have different varieties of languages, very different varieties of languages, even that. So this is a methodological issue with making comparisons. But then, first of all, why would one need to make a comparison between a bilingual and a monolingual? To me, that is, you're categorizing people. I'm now doing it myself. But first, I think categorizing people is really problematic in itself. I prefer to say, basically, but of course it takes many more words. A person who can understand two languages. Something like that, rather than a bilingual. But we do it anyway. But it's basically, you should always think like that's just a short form for something much more complex. And then why would you want to compare those two kinds of people, if they are truly two different kinds of people? That's one issue. And another issue is it's often it's done with the monolingual being the standard that the bilingual is being compared to. I resent that terribly. Why not the other way around? And I can just give you one example that if from my own research I've done comparisons, as I said, with very little children, 13-month-old children, compared them bilinguals with monolinguals, children who were learning two languages from birth, children who were learning just one language from birth. And I counted the number of words that they understand. There is this general mythical idea that bilinguals know fewer words than monolinguals. Sorry, so far I can't find the evidence for that. But then with these little children, the 13-month-old bilinguals knew in total, over all their words combined, they knew 70% more words than the 13-month-old monolinguals at the same age. So we have norming tables for how many words do we expect children to understand at a certain age, which is very important if we want to know whether there's a language learning problem.
Yeah.
So basically, these monolinguals, compared to the bilinguals, they're 4 months behind, if you look at in terms of norming tables.
Wow, 70% more. That's a big difference.
That's a huge difference. But do you know, so far, nobody has really, it's appeared in print, but there's nobody so far, except myself, who really then projects this as something, wow, that's great for bilinguals, isn't it? No, because there is such this reluctance to see anything positive about bilinguals. It's discrimination. I'm sorry. So from that perspective, this bilingual advantage hypothesis, cognitive advantage hypothesis, is kind of like the other way, the balance. Finally, there's something positive that's being said about bilinguals, right? Which everybody kind of likes because, well, or a lot of people think is very important because being smarter is like so important to be smarter than somebody else. That we can argue about that too. And is it about being smarter? I know it's not. It's about executive function. It's a different thing. It's not about necessarily any kind of intelligence, however you may want to measure that. But I think we're going there in the other direction. And do we have to? Do we have to compare bilinguals and monolinguals? And there it becomes, again, it's so complex. Because, maybe it's not about how many languages you know. Maybe it's about using your brain and as more generally, maybe it's about being stimulated more. Maybe it's not about the actual languages. Maybe it's about if we find an effect, which we know that some people have found confirmation of an effect and others have not. So I'm not going to judge on that. I just know, for me, it's like, I'm not the specialist here, but I hear the arguments, and it's not a kind of trend in research that I find ultimately, it's not a race. It's not a race between monolinguals and between bilinguals. I think it's really much more important to understand, for me, why in real life, is this one person who has several languages, are they like really unhappy about it, basically? Yeah. And this other family or other person has no problem with it. That's really what I'm more interested in rather than who's better.
That's fascinating to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah, it makes me think that maybe a lot of us have kind of latched on to this bilingual advantage because we want to say, see, that's why bilingualism is good and should be promoted. But it almost comes from a defensive stance, like we have to defend bilingualism because it's under attack and it's being placed against monolingualism as the standard.
Right. Yeah. Yes, and I wrote a long time ago in a Cal Digest, which came out in '98, I think, a long time ago, that bilingualism for a child is not a choice. It's there. There's people who speak different languages or not. When I move to another country, it's not a choice. I've got to learn this other language where I'm going to be. It's not a choice. It's just, and luckily I can until I'm old, and I can learn new languages whenever, as long as I have the opportunity and people give me the opportunity. But then I've got to be able to take it too, So that is important, but it's often not a choice. It's not like, okay, are we going to do it or are we not going to do it? And often you're born into a multilingual setting, a multilingual environment. Well, where is the option? So if it were an option like, okay, I can choose to be monolingual, I can choose to be bilingual. Let me tell you, I'm so happy I'm not monolingual. What would I have all missed? And that's a lot what it's about, What would I have all missed? I couldn't talk to you if I were monolingual because my first language where I was born, that was Dutch, yes? So if I couldn't speak English to you, I couldn't speak to you.
This conversation,
if I didn't know English, yes, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be a scholar either without my own personal multilingualism or bilingualism. The world would be so much smaller. So that is, I would have so few friends because my world would be so much smaller. Now you say then if you're an English speaker, you have already a much bigger world. So that's very lucky for an English speaker, That's very lucky. But at the same time, it's a bit sad because maybe they have fewer opportunities or fewer, to really learn other languages as well. And that really keeps you from really understanding so much about other people and about other cultures. It's sad. It is really sad.
Yes.
Yes. But of course, you're born where you're born. But you can change, and these days through internet apps, applications, you can learn other languages. Of course, it's not easy. It's not easy if you're not in an environment that kind of stimulates it naturally. That is true. That is true.
Yeah, I can identify with that. I feel like in school, when I was taught Spanish a little bit here and there, in middle school, it was very hard to pick up living in the States.
Right.
But when I had the opportunity to travel in Latin America and to live with families there, and to actually use Spanish for a real social purpose, to connect with people, then I was like, oh my gosh, I can learn languages, and I am picking this up, much to my surprise. And it unlocked so many doors to be able to communicate. That feeling is amazing, to connect with people in their natural language. And I just wish more people everywhere, and especially within the United States, from my experience, could have that opportunity. And it would be just a natural part of life to learn it for these social purposes.
Right, exactly. Yeah, language is about communicating. That's the bottom line, It's not just an instrument, it is, it just is, and most people don't think about it very much either, and that's fine. You don't have to, just use it, but don't take away somebody else's rights to use it. I think that's really very important, and
Well, thanks so much. Your work has been very inspiring, and
thank you.
I hope to help to contribute to what you've started here.
Well, wonderful, and it's great that you're here, and thank you very much for interviewing me and asking such interesting questions.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Okay.